She purchased odd amounts of medicines, enough to make any pharmacist pause, but explained it away as care for children from unfortunate circumstances, children arriving sick or malnourished, needing constant attention. The Sullivan farm followed a rhythm that confounded neighbors. While most households rose with the sun and retreated with its setting, activity on the Sullivan property often stretched far into the night, lanterns flickering like watchful eyes among the shadows of the fields. In the spring of 1834, nestled somewhere in the rolling hills of central Virginia, the unimaginable was uncovered. 47 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16, were found shackled in the basement of what appeared, on the surface, to be an ordinary farmhouse. These children bore no resemblance to one another, spoke different languages, yet all whispered the same name through trembling lips and tear-streaked faces, Mother Sullivan. The sheriff's report, long buried in the Henry County archives, detailed horrors so profound that 3 officers abandoned their posts within a week, unable to reconcile the reality of what they had seen. What makes this atrocity even more terrifying is that it had been hidden for decades. Constance Sullivan, who the children called Mother, had orchestrated her ghastly operation for over 20 years, completely unnoticed by a close-knit rural community. That title, Mother, was a lie wrapped in the cruelest irony. Beneath it hid manipulation, abuse, and a darkness so pervasive that it defies comprehension. Before we journey deeper into the Sullivan family's nightmare, understand this: the story you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Some truths are too grotesque to ignore, yet too disturbing to face lightly. Only the brave, those willing to peer into the abyss, will truly comprehend. So lean closer, let the shadows envelop you, and prepare to follow the trail into a past so twisted it chills the soul. The question that haunted investigators then and continues to perplex historians is simple and terrifying. How could such an operation of such unimaginable scale have been invisible for so long? In 1834, Virginia teetered between the old world of plantations and the whispers of industrial change drifting from the north. Millbrook, a quiet community of 50 or so families spread across rolling hills, seemed the perfect setting for a secret to fester unnoticed. Most residents farmed tobacco or corn, traded at the modest general store, or gathered at the small schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall. Life was simple, predictable, perfectly ordinary. The Sullivan farmhouse sat at the edge of this community, a 2-story wooden structure wrapped in white clapboards, its facade calm and unassuming. A red barn loomed a short distance behind, alongside a chicken coop and a smokehouse. From the road, the property appeared as ordinary as any other. Nothing hinted at the horrors concealed below. Ezra Sullivan had purchased the land in 1809 with money inherited from his father's tobacco fortune. Soon after, he began expanding the basement far beyond the footprint of the house, transforming what should have been a simple root cellar into a subterranean labyrinth. Local craftsmen remembered working on the excavation, each paid generously, and asked never to question the project as a whole. They were given tasks, section by section, and told to focus only on their work. No one ever saw the completed basement, not in its entirety. Constance Sullivan arrived in Millbrook in 1811, a 22-year-old bride with dark hair and an unusually soft voice. Neighbors found her attractive, poised, charitable, a woman who attended Methodist services when health allowed, always dressed neatly, always calm, always seemingly kind. She offered explanations for the children glimpsed around the farm. Orphans, she said, from her family in Pennsylvania, temporarily in her care until permanent homes could be arranged. The town, accustomed to tragedy and high child mortality, accepted her story without suspicion. Occasionally, Mrs. Henderson at the general store would see a child's pale face peering from the Sullivan wagon as Constance shopped for supplies. The children never spoke. They simply watched, silent and somber. Constance would soothe curiosity with gentle words, describing their trauma, their shyness, their need for time to adjust. The townsfolk, familiar with hardship and loss, nodded in understanding, never questioning further. Thomas Henderson, the storekeeper, remembered her as a reliable, meticulous customer. Every 2 weeks, she arrived with lists and cash sufficient to purchase quantities of flour, cornmeal, salt, pork, molasses, and other staples that seemed far too large for a couple without children. When he hesitated or questioned the amounts, Constance would gently remind him of the orphans. The explanation, plausible on the surface, cloaked the grim truth beneath layers of normalcy. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, the air of the Sullivan property carried a tension no one noticed, a rhythm of whispers, soft footsteps, and locks clicking shut. The basement, invisible from above, held secrets that the outside world could not imagine: chains, darkness, hunger, and the endless echo of children calling for a mother who was both their caretaker and their captor. Each child carried the marks of fear and neglect, their lives bound not only in iron, but in the suffocating oppression of someone who had perfected the art of concealment. It is impossible to convey fully the weight of what was discovered. Not just the chains, the hidden rooms, or the unimaginable number of children, but the quiet horror of a life meticulously orchestrated in secret, where cruelty masqueraded as charity, and where evil could exist for decades under the guise of goodness. Constance Sullivan's name is remembered not as a symbol of motherhood, but as a shadow that fell over innocence, a darkness so complete it took the sheriff's officers months to untangle the truth, and left them, for some, permanently haunted. And so, we begin our descent into the story of the Sullivan family, into a world where horror hides in plain sight, and the boundaries between care and cruelty vanish. This is a story of chains, silence, and the chilling realization that evil, when patient and clever, can dwell undisturbed even in the sunlit hills of Virginia. This is the tale of 47 children, the basement where they were found, and the mother who became a monster in the eyes of history. A story that whispers still, from shadowed archives to our ears today. Lights glimmered in the farmhouse windows long after the sun had vanished, shadows shifting unnaturally across the walls as if the house itself were alive. At odd hours, the hammering of unseen workmen echoed faintly over the fields, carrying through the chill night air like a secret rhythm no one outside the Sullivan property was meant to hear. When questioned, Ezra would claim improvements, expansions to make room for the growing number of children in their care, a simple, harmless explanation. But even the traveling physician, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, who tended the sick in Millbrook during the 1820s and early 1830s, sensed unease each time he was summoned. He was never allowed to see the children himself. Constance would stand between him and her wards, describing symptoms, prescribing medications, insisting it was for the children's own protection, that strangers were frightening, that young souls, fragile from misfortune, could not endure examination by unfamiliar men. Even Reverend Samuel Matthews, who visited the farm to witness what he believed was Christian charity, remained blind to the horror lurking beneath polite facades. He offered to help place the orphans in permanent homes, convinced by Constance's carefully constructed stories of correspondence with distant relatives in Pennsylvania. Patience, she said. Careful planning. Time. The pastor never suspected that decades of deception had gone into this performance, that the children were never temporary guests awaiting adoption. They were captives, stolen or bought, torn from families across state lines, imprisoned in darkness so complete that even hardened men recoiled at the thought. It was the winter of 1834, a bitter season when Virginia's hills were swallowed by snow and ice. The cold should have been a curse, yet it became a catalyst for discovery. On the 23rd of February, a merchant named Jacob Stern, journeying between Richmond and Charlottesville, was forced to seek shelter as a violent blizzard raged. The Sullivan farm appeared first on the horizon, a solitary structure in the white expanse. Hospitality Ezra could hardly refuse, even if it made him visibly uneasy. Stern later recalled a night steeped in tension, where the flicker of candlelight seemed to stretch shadows unnaturally across the walls, and Constance moved with deliberate grace, serving a meager supper of cornbread and salt pork, while the air felt heavy with unspoken fears. Throughout the night, Stern could hear faint sounds beneath the floorboards, muffled crying, whispers of despair that gnawed at his mind. When he mentioned it to Ezra the following morning, the explanation was simple: ordinary wind through gaps in the foundation, a quirk of old houses during harsh winters. Stern wanted to believe it. He wanted to dismiss the tremor of dread that lingered in his chest. But the Sullivans' furtive glances, their nervous stiffness, left impressions that no rational explanation could erase. Weeks later, in mid-March, another incident unfolded. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish girl traveling with her family to work the tobacco fields near Richmond, became separated from her group at a river crossing. Night fell, cold and ominous, and the Sullivan farm appeared like a promise of refuge. Constance welcomed her with warmth, food, and a place to rest. Mary Catherine vanished that night. Her family reported her disappearance to the sheriff, a search party scouring the wilderness for days. Yet the dense Virginia woods swallowed the trail, and she was presumed dead, a casualty of exposure, of wild beasts, or perhaps of something far more sinister. It was the second day of April when the thread of terror finally snapped into clarity. William Hutchinson, a local farmer, was hunting rabbits near the Sullivan property when a sound froze him in his tracks. It was not the shriek of startled wildlife or the laughter of children at play. These were screams, raw, unfiltered, filled with terror so deep it vibrated in the marrow. Hutchinson crept closer, hiding behind oak trees 50 yards from the house, the snow crunching underfoot, betraying every step. The cries continued intermittently, always seeming to rise from beneath the floorboards, rather than the rooms above. And then he saw Ezra Sullivan emerging briefly from a side cellar door. Ezra glanced around, panic flashing across his features, then vanished back into the darkness below. Hutchinson returned to the town, shaken, repeating what he had witnessed. Reactions varied. Some whispered that the children might be disturbed or ill, that perhaps the Sullivans' methods were harsh, but necessary, a secret remedy beyond the comprehension of outsiders. Others shuddered, their instincts warning that the explanations did not satisfy the gnawing sense of dread that had begun to take root. The farm had always appeared normal, a simple farmhouse surrounded by fields of tobacco and corn, a red barn in the distance, the semblance of rural tranquility masking what lay beneath. Every visitor, every neighbor, every pastor and merchant who stepped onto the property had been deceived. The ordinary meal, the polite smiles, the occasional glimpses of pale, quiet children, they were all pieces of a meticulous masquerade. In truth, the basement stretched far beyond any root cellar, a maze of shadows and iron chains, where 47 children endured a nightmare that spanned years, each day an echo of the last, each night deeper than the one before. This is the world Constance Sullivan built, one of secrecy and illusion, where terror wore the mask of care, where evil lingered unseen in plain sight, and where silence became the most powerful weapon. The cries that reached outsiders were fragments, glimpses of a truth too horrifying for the townsfolk to accept, yet they persisted, haunting anyone sensitive enough to notice. And as the snow melted, revealing footprints, strange disappearances, and the faint sound of muffled wails beneath the farmhouse, the inevitable reckoning approached. It was in this tension, this delicate balance between the ordinary and the monstrous, that the first cracks in the Sullivan illusion appeared. A single traveler, a lost child, a vigilant farmer, these were the catalysts that finally exposed the depth of the horror. And as the story of the Sullivan farm would unfold, it would not merely shock the town, but echo through history, a chilling testament to the darkness that can thrive when patience, cunning, and cruelty combine in the heart of a seemingly innocent home. Whispers began to stir among the neighbors, fragments of unsettling observations long dismissed as trivial. The enormous quantities of flour, pork, and cornmeal Constance Sullivan purchased. The strange, almost mechanical sounds echoing across the fields late at night. The fact that none of her supposed orphans were ever seen in town, never at the schoolhouse, never in the square during community gatherings. At first, the local lawman ignored such murmurs, attributing them to idle gossip. But when William Hutchinson approached Sheriff Benjamin Crawford directly, insistence in his voice cutting through doubt, the sheriff could no longer ignore the warning. By law, he had no choice. Reports of possible child abuse demanded investigation, regardless of personal skepticism. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Crawford rode toward the Sullivan property with his deputy, Marcus Webb, the mist of early dawn curling around the wagon wheels. They anticipated a perfunctory inspection, expecting polite explanations and perhaps an awkward glimpse at a few ill children, nothing more. Constance met them at the door, calm, welcoming, the faintest trace of a smile hiding a tension she could not fully mask. She invited them inside, offering coffee, conversation, assurances that the gossip circulating through Millbrook was untrue. Letters from Pennsylvania were spread across the table, neatly penned, supposedly proof that the children were under the temporary care of her distant family. She promised that the sheriff could meet them once their illnesses had passed, painting a picture of normalcy, of charity, of patience. Everything seemed ordinary, until Deputy Webb requested to use the privy. Walking around the side of the house, the faint crunch of frost beneath his boots carried him closer to the side cellar door. What he saw made the blood drain from his face. 3 padlocks held the door fast, wrapped in thick iron chains. The wood surrounding the locks bore scratches, claw marks, evidence of desperate attempts to escape. Something had fought against those chains. Something had wanted freedom. Webb returned quietly to Crawford, the color gone from his face, and whispered what he had seen. Crawford's experience told him immediately that this was far beyond idle gossip, beyond small-town suspicions. Politely, he asked Constance to allow them to inspect the cellar, framing it as a matter of thoroughness to dispel rumors. Once and for all, the change in her demeanor was instantaneous. A cold pallor replaced the warmth in her cheeks. Her hands shook visibly. She stammered excuses about danger, about the children never being allowed below, about nothing but old equipment stored there. And then they heard it. From somewhere deep beneath their feet, muffled cries, a soft, terror-laced voice calling for help. The sound was faint, yet unmistakable, emanating directly from the earth, beneath the kitchen where they stood. What followed would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. Forcing the cellar door open, the stench hit them first, a combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, and something unnameable, a pervasive aura of despair that clung to the air like a living thing. The basement that Ezra Sullivan had spent over 20 years constructing was more than a root cellar. It was a labyrinth of cruelty, a subterranean fortress of suffering. Stone walls, expertly mortared, twisted into interconnected chambers designed to muffle sound, to keep the world above ignorant of the horrors below. The largest room lay directly beneath the kitchen, where most of the children were confined. They were shackled to iron rings, embedded in the cold stone walls, chains looped around ankles, granting movement only within a tiny, circumscribed space. Their bodies were skeletal, clothing reduced to rags, skin showing the scars of neglect, bruises, sores, and the unrelenting imprint of fear. Ages ranged from 6 to 16, yet in their eyes was not the spark of childhood curiosity, but a hollow, vacant gaze, the absence of hope, the quiet acceptance of misery. After the initial cries, silence descended. The children said nothing more, their tiny bodies trembling yet still, as if speaking might summon further punishment. Deputy Webb, a father himself, fled the basement twice, overcome by nausea. Sheriff Crawford, seasoned in human cruelty, found his training inadequate. Nothing in his experience could have prepared him for such meticulously orchestrated depravity. The methodical nature of the captivity, the evidence of long-term planning, the sheer number of victims, it was staggering, incomprehensible. In adjoining chambers, the Sullivan system of control became horrifyingly clear. One room contained stocks and restraining devices, primitive tools of punishment. Another appeared to function as a crude medical station, not for comfort or compassion, but to maintain the children's fragile survival, keeping them functional long enough to serve the twisted purposes of their captors. In yet another chamber lay records, painstakingly detailed lists of names, ages, arrival dates, notes on behavior and health. These records revealed the magnitude of the horror. The children had been arriving steadily since 1812, shortly after Constance's arrival in Millbrook. Some were purchased from poorhouses, others enticed with promises of food or shelter. Still others abducted outright from their families. Over the decades, more than 90 children had passed through the Sullivan basement, some surviving, some vanishing without a trace. The Sullivans' facade, their polite manners, their seemingly charitable disposition, had shielded this darkness for decades. A community blind to cruelty, a house hiding its screams beneath ordinary floorboards, a mother whose title concealed monstrosity, the elements aligned perfectly, making discovery almost impossible. Yet in the end, chance, persistence, and a sharp ear for cries of terror had unveiled the truth. The sheriff and his deputy stood among the evidence of decades of suffering, the weight of human cruelty pressing down like the stones of the basement walls themselves. They understood, finally, that the farmhouse above was not what it seemed. The light of morning revealed nothing of the nightmare below. Only the echoes, the stains, the chains, and the silent children remained, a testament to the darkness that can dwell, undisturbed, beneath even the most ordinary roof. Even after the chains were broken, and the first cries of the children pierced the air, the horrors beneath the Sullivan farmhouse were far from fully revealed. Constance had requested sedatives and other potent medications, drugs designed not to heal, but to control, to pacify those who might resist. And when Sheriff Crawford and Deputy Webb pressed further into the labyrinthine basement, the true scale of the atrocity unfolded in a way that seared itself into their memories forever. Through a narrow crawl space, squeezed between damp stone walls, the officers discovered a chamber unlike anything they had imagined. Shallow graves lined the floor, each covered with lime to suppress the stench, each concealing the broken bodies of 36 children. Some had succumbed to malnutrition or disease, their frail forms unable to withstand the years of neglect. Others bore unmistakable marks of violence, bruises, cuts, and worse, that spoke of punishments inflicted with deliberate cruelty. The sight was unbearable, yet the officers pressed on, documenting each revelation, though they would later admit that a full understanding of the horror seemed almost impossible. The investigation that followed stretched for months, an arduous descent into the mind of a woman whose genius for deception was as disturbing as the acts she had committed. Constance Sullivan had mastered the art of illusion, constructing a persona so carefully that no one, neither neighbor, pastor, nor physician, had questioned her for over 2 decades. The charitable caregiver mask appealed to the town's Christian sensibilities, explained the sporadic glimpses of children, and justified the otherwise suspicious aspects of the household. Traumatized, frightened children provided the perfect excuse for why the orphans were never seen in public. Letters from distant relatives explained why they never left the farm. It was a system built on lies layered upon lies, each reinforcing the next. Even more chilling was her attention to psychological control. The children were trained to call her mother, a word that to outsiders suggested love and family, while instilling fear and obedience in the hearts of the victims. Any child seen by neighbors was coached to appear shy and withdrawn, never terrified, ensuring no suspicion arose. The immense quantities of food, the detailed medical requests, all were woven seamlessly into the facade of benevolence. To an outsider, everything appeared perfectly ordinary, even generous. The physical architecture of the Sullivan operation reflected the same meticulous planning. The basement had been constructed over years, each worker completing only their assigned portion, never seeing the larger design. The layout was intentionally labyrinthine, the walls thick and soundproofed, muffling cries that might have otherwise drawn attention. Even neighbors close to the farmhouse rarely heard anything unexplainable, and when they did, the noises could always be rationalized: creaking floorboards, farm work, children at play. Yet the psychological grip Constance held over her captives was perhaps the most horrifying element. The children were told their families had abandoned them, that the world outside was dangerous, hostile, and untrustworthy. Rewards and punishments reinforced compliance. Those who obeyed received slightly better food, marginally improved sleeping conditions. Those who resisted were disciplined, their suffering serving as a cautionary example. Over time, many children internalized this system, accepting their imprisonment as the only reality they could know. The revelation of the Sullivan horrors shocked the Millbrook community to its core. Disbelief reigned. How could a quiet woman, living among them for over 20 years, perpetrate such unimaginable cruelty? Some speculated coercion by Ezra, others suggested misunderstanding, yet the mounting evidence made denial impossible. Records found in the basement revealed not only the names and ages of the children, but also correspondence with a network of criminals spanning multiple states. The Sullivan farm was but one node in a sprawling human trafficking operation, stretching from Pennsylvania to Georgia, exchanging children as if they were commodities. As Sheriff Crawford examined the letters, patterns of sinister organization emerged. Simple codes concealed discussions of shipments, quality, and compliance, each communication carefully constructed to mask the reality of human lives being bought, sold, and exploited. A single letter, dated merely 3 months before the discovery, described 6 new items, with precise notes about their ages, health, and temperament, explicitly identifying which children required additional training to ensure obedience. Financial records compounded the horror, payments ranging from $50 to $200 per child, transactions accumulating to more than $8,000 over 20 years, hundreds of thousands in modern terms, all for the calculated subjugation of the innocent. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, The traveling physician who had visited the Sullivan farm for years became a crucial witness. His testimony revealed that Constance had consistently requested very specific medications, reflecting an alarming understanding of malnutrition, infections, and the ailments common among neglected children. Her knowledge was clinical, precise, and disturbing, medical care not administered out of compassion, but as a tool of maintenance, ensuring her captives survived just enough to serve her twisted enterprise. Every discovery, every record, every trace of the children's suffering pointed to the same grim truth. Constance Sullivan's operation was a masterpiece of deception, cruelty, and strategic manipulation. Every lie, every structural modification, every psychological manipulation had been meticulously crafted over decades, allowing a nightmare to thrive undisturbed beneath the veneer of normalcy. The farmhouse, the children, the basement, all were components of a reality so horrifying it seemed to transcend belief. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. The Sullivan case would linger in history as a stark reminder of how darkness can hide behind ordinary appearances, how evil can be patient, calculated, and devastatingly efficient. And though the children were eventually freed, the echoes of chains, the shadows of despair, and the invisible scars of years spent in captivity remained, haunting every memory of the farm long after the doors were forced open. The story of Constance Sullivan, her calculated cruelty, and the intricate web she wove, is more than a historical account. It is a chilling testament to the depths of human malevolence. A tale that whispers still through the archives and echoes in the imagination of all who dare confront it. The physician's testimony opened a door to a new layer of horror. Constance Sullivan had not simply been cruel, she had been methodical, almost scientific in her approach to sustaining life under extreme deprivation. Every supply she ordered, every question she posed to the doctor, every careful detail of the basement's construction was designed with chilling precision. Her goal was not to nurture, but to maximize survival, just enough for the prisoners to endure, just enough for the system to continue functioning efficiently, while demanding the least amount of resources. Every choice reflected a cold, calculated logic, a grotesque understanding of how to manipulate flesh, spirit, and fear. Local merchant Thomas Henderson added another piece to the grim puzzle. A review of his records revealed decades of increasing purchases by Constance Sullivan: blankets, clothing, basic food staples, simple medications, everything explained at the time as the needs of a charitable household. Yet in retrospect, the pattern told a darker story. It was not charity, it was expansion. Each transaction a cog in a monstrous, methodically run operation. Henderson recalled her unusual requests: extra clothing for children, large bundles of medicinal herbs, items that seemed oddly specific but were, in fact, instruments of control. Ezra Sullivan, though less prominent in public, emerged as the silent architect of terror alongside his wife. Where Constance orchestrated the psychological and operational framework, Ezra maintained the physical prison. Survivors would later describe him as a relentless enforcer, a shadow of punishment who moved through the basement like a predator, ensuring discipline, instilling fear, refining the underground labyrinth that had become a world of its own. The basement expansions over the years were not random improvements. They were calculated refinements, creating a cage that was invisible to the world above but unyielding below. The ledgers offered another, darker revelation. Some children had been moved to other locations, evidence of a network of trafficking stretching across state lines. Others, marked as problematic or unsuitable, matched the grim tally of bodies buried beneath the floor. As investigators traced these connections, reports of missing children in Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina began to align with the profile of the Sullivan victims: poor, orphaned, vulnerable, easily overlooked. Federal marshals were drawn into the investigation, coordinating what would become one of the first multi-state criminal probes in American history. Jurisdictions clashed, laws differed, yet the enormity of the Sullivan operation demanded cooperation beyond local boundaries. Survivors' testimonies painted a picture of life under the Sullivans that was almost impossible to comprehend. They spoke of years spent in chains, of isolation, of punishments inflicted with precision to ensure obedience. They described an intricate hierarchy among the prisoners. Older children granted small privileges in exchange for policing the younger ones, the system turning victim against victim. Constance's psychological mastery was horrifying in its subtlety. She convinced the children that they were unwanted, abandoned, unworthy of love, that the outside world was a menace, more terrifying than the confinement she orchestrated. Some older captives resisted rescue, clinging to the prison as a warped sanctuary, a perverse testament to the depths of conditioning she had enforced. The methods of acquiring new victims were no less calculated. Constance had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials at orphanages and poorhouses, paying handsomely for children who would be unlikely to prompt rigorous searches. Criminal networks in cities provided information on vulnerable runaways, street orphans, and children who would vanish without immediate notice. And according to the records, the Sullivan enterprise was expanding, growing bolder with each passing year, with plans for new facilities and further shipments. The discovery of the basement interrupted a carefully timed operation poised to extend its reach even further. Yet it was the testimony of one child that finally unraveled the full scope of the horror. Rebecca, 14, had endured the Sullivan basement longer than any other survivor, yet unlike her peers, she had not been entirely broken. Her memory was sharp, her defiance faint but persistent, a spark of light amid darkness. Kidnapped from her Pennsylvania home at the age of 9, Rebecca recalled every detail: the deceptive arrival of a woman claiming distant kinship, the lure of sweets, the ride that led to captivity, the awakening chained in the basement. She remembered every conversation, every whispered plan, every coded instruction that had passed in the presence of visitors and the Sullivans themselves. Rebecca's recollections revealed the Sullivan farm as only one node in a sprawling network. She spoke of other farms, other holding facilities, names, dates, shipments, all carefully coordinated, all aimed at controlling, moving, and distributing children across state lines. Her account offered investigators the first coherent glimpse of a criminal machine whose scale and sophistication were previously unimaginable. Perhaps the most chilling piece came when she described a visit just weeks before the discovery. The whispers, the instructions, the coded exchanges, everything was intended to prepare the farm for continued operation. Rebecca remembered lists of children, instructions for training, punishments planned, the ordering of new arrivals. She recalled Ezra inspecting chains, Constance discussing shipments, every detail etched into her mind, a map of the system of terror that had operated in plain sight for decades. Through her testimony, through the surviving records, through the painstaking reconstruction of shipments, purchases, and communications, the authorities began to understand a truth more horrifying than any single discovery. The Sullivan farm was not an anomaly. It was a model of methodical, patient, and calculated evil, a system that thrived for over 20 years through deception, cruelty, and an uncanny understanding of human psychology. The scale, the precision, and the unrelenting darkness of the enterprise left a mark that would haunt investigators, survivors, and the history of Henrico County forever. Even as the children were freed, their chains removed, the legacy of fear remained. Years of captivity, indoctrination, and psychological torment had left scars that no comfort could erase. The story of Constance Sullivan, of her meticulous cruelty and her sprawling network, is not merely a historical record. It is a living nightmare, a chilling reminder that darkness can hide beneath the most ordinary surfaces, whispering still to those willing to listen. A man arrived at the Sullivan farm in a carriage polished to a gleam, accompanied by 2 attendants whose presence added an air of silent authority. Rebecca and 3 other children had been selected for inspection, lined up as if on display, their small bodies measured and examined with clinical detachment. The visitor studied them with unsettling precision, probing their teeth, flexing their limbs, observing muscle tone, evaluating health as one might assess livestock destined for market. The cold efficiency of it was impossible to comprehend, human lives reduced to commodities on a sheet of paper. In the end, the man dismissed the children. They were, in his estimation, flawed, damaged goods, unsuitable for his purposes. Yet he left behind a document, a letter buried among Constance Sullivan's papers, written in the same detached, businesslike tone that made the stomach churn. It contained meticulous specifications for children, desired ages, physical traits, temperaments, even behavioral tendencies. Every word underscored the horrifying fact that human beings were being catalogued and traded as though they were merchandise. The letter bore the signature H. Blackwood, along with a return address in Charleston, South Carolina. Investigators quickly traced Blackwood to a wealthy plantation owner, a man whose ostensible intent of employing children as household servants masked intentions far darker than anyone could have imagined. The Blackwood connection expanded the scope of the investigation into a terrifying new dimension. Southern plantation owners, it appeared, had been using the Sullivan network to obtain children entirely under their control, free from oversight or accountability. Unlike enslaved laborers, whose absence might attract attention or legal scrutiny, trafficked children were invisible. They had no legal identity, no families capable of searching for them, and no protection under law. They were expendable, their suffering unrecorded, their lives subjugated to the whims of wealth and power. As authorities pursued these leads, the sinister scale of the network became increasingly apparent. Letters, coded notes, and transactional records revealed that numerous prominent Southern families had participated in similar purchases. The children were not merely servants. They were victims of cruelty far beyond forced labor. Some were subjected to medical experimentation, others to brutal entertainments, acts so abhorrent that investigators would later refrain from fully recording them in official reports. The network's reach, sophistication, and calculated violence were staggering. Powerful forces moved swiftly to protect themselves. Threats began to materialize against law enforcement officers, witnesses, and even the surviving children. Anonymous letters warned Sheriff Crawford to abandon the case. Deputy Webb, walking home one evening, was assaulted by unseen assailants. Dr. Whitfield suddenly found his medical practice ostracized by influential patients. And most chilling of all, a boy named Timothy, who had been providing critical testimony, vanished from the temporary shelter where he was housed. A search yielded nothing. The message was unmistakable: cooperation would carry consequences. Yet the investigation pressed forward. Federal marshals provided security. Survivors were relocated to secure locations, and armed guards patrolled the Sullivan property to preserve evidence. The case had become a test of the American legal system itself, a challenge to enforce justice against perpetrators whose wealth and influence could bend or intimidate the machinery of law. Then came the death of Constance Sullivan, found in her jail cell under circumstances officially labeled a suicide. She had been scheduled to testify on the full extent of the criminal network, poised to name contacts and buyers across multiple states. Her death silenced the most critical witness, erasing the last direct account of the operation's inner workings, and sending a chilling message: no one involved was safe. Investigators now faced the stark reality that the enterprise they were unraveling had the reach and power to eliminate threats, to strike fear into all who sought the truth. Just when the case seemed poised to collapse under intimidation, an unexpected revelation breathed new life into the pursuit of justice. Samuel Pierce, a former overseer for Henry Blackwood, stepped forward, driven by guilt and the burden of what he had witnessed. Pierce brought with him documents corroborating the Sullivan network's connection to Blackwood and other Southern buyers. More terrifying still, he carried first-hand knowledge of the fate awaiting the children who had passed through Sullivan's basement and onto plantations, a testimony so chilling that even veteran investigators recoiled. Before the federal grand jury in Richmond, Pierce recounted the operation in painstaking detail. He described the plantation's dual systems, one for labor, where children were put to work under brutal supervision, and another where they were subjected to punishments, experiments, and routines that mirrored the psychological control they had endured under the Sullivans. He spoke of the children's chains, their isolation, the manipulation that had broken their spirits, and the absolute obedience demanded by those in power. Every detail confirmed that the horrors of Millbrook were merely a node in a sprawling network of exploitation stretching across the South. Pierce's testimony illuminated the terrifying reality that the Sullivan farm was neither isolated nor unique. It was a model of methodical cruelty, one that had inspired a wider system in which human lives could be bought, sold, and destroyed with impunity. Each revelation, each account, each ledger or coded letter expanded the horror. What had begun as the discovery of chained children in a Virginia basement now unfolded as a vast conspiracy, implicating the very foundations of society, reaching into the wealthiest households, the most influential families, and the hidden machinery of commerce and corruption. The network's operation, the psychological mastery, the meticulous record-keeping, and the absolute disregard for life combined to form a nightmare whose echoes linger still. The story of Constance Sullivan, her husband Ezra, and the Southern buyers is more than history. It is a warning, a dark mirror reflecting what humanity can perpetrate when greed, power, and cruelty converge. Even now, the whispers of this network drift through archives, through old letters, through the testimonies of those who survived. The horror persists, not just in the past, but as a shadow that continues to fascinate, terrify, and compel all who dare to listen to gospel of the haunted. The Maine plantation thrived on the cruel, unyielding system of enslaved labor, sprawling fields of cotton bending under the weight of toil and suffering. Yet, hidden in the shadows of this familiar brutality, Henry Blackwood had built something far more insidious, a separate enclave, a place Pierce would later call the experimental quarters. Here, the children trafficked through the Sullivan network were brought not to work the fields, but to serve purposes that made even the darkest imaginings falter. They were not laborers. They were specimens, objects of experimentation, stripped of humanity, reduced to data points in a catalogue of pain. Blackwood had enlisted the aid of 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College, men whose curiosity eclipsed conscience, who viewed these children as living instruments ripe for study. Pierce recounted the chilling detail of what transpired within the walls of the experimental quarters. Drugs were administered, illnesses induced, and treatments tested, all to observe the limits of human endurance. Every reaction, every survival, every failure was logged meticulously in Blackwood's records. Pages upon pages of cold, precise notes described how children responded to starvation, to poisons, to surgical procedures without anesthesia, as if he were charting the yield of a farm crop, instead of the lives of human beings. The numbers alone were horrifying. 37 children from the Sullivan network had been sent to Blackwood's plantation. Only 4 survived, long enough to be transferred elsewhere. The remainder perished under the weight of malnutrition, disease, or the unrelenting cruelty of experimentation. Their small bodies were interred in unmarked graves on remote, forgotten soil, hidden from the eyes of the world, each grave a mute testament to the calculated, systemic evil that Blackwood had cultivated. Pierce's revelations went further, exposing the broader, almost incomprehensible reach of the trafficking network. He described clandestine meetings where Blackwood conferred with plantation owners, wealthy businessmen, and politicians, each participant selecting children like one would examine merchandise at an auction. The scale of the enterprise unfolded as Pierce recounted a gathering in the fall of 1833, an event designed to showcase the children, to demonstrate their capacities, their obedience, their endurance to punishment, and, horrifyingly, their suitability for exploitation in various forms. Some members of the grand jury were forced to leave the room, unable to bear the spectacle, the casualness with which human lives were appraised and traded. At the demonstration, children were tested in ways that defy imagination, their responses to pain, fear, and control scrutinized with an objective coldness that blurred the line between science and monstrosity. The buyers were encouraged to examine them, to prod, to place orders for the type of victims they preferred, ages, temperaments, physical attributes catalogued in a ledger, as if the world itself were merely an extension of Blackwood's plantation. The children its resources. Prices fluctuated with age and perceived obedience. Younger, more malleable children commanded a premium, while those with special characteristics, talents, or endurance brought higher sums. Hundreds of thousands of dollars changed hands across the decades, a fortune fueled by suffering, misery, and silence. Using Pierce's testimony, federal marshals coordinated sweeping raids across the South. Plantations, warehouses, and hidden compounds were simultaneously struck, executed with such secrecy that perpetrators could not destroy evidence, nor could the children vanish into the shadows again. The results were staggering. Over 100 additional children were rescued, their bodies scarred by abuse, emaciated from neglect, and haunted by the memories of confinement and torment. Ledgers, correspondences, and purchase logs were seized, revealing the vast, methodical network, its reach stretching from Virginia to the Carolinas, beyond, infecting the highest levels of society with complicity. Prominent individuals were arrested. Blackwood himself, the physicians complicit in the experiments, and even a legislator from Georgia, men who had exploited the system with impunity, were brought to account. The evidence painted a picture of systematic, organized evil that stunned the nation. The network had operated for over 30 years, its precision, scale, and cruelty unprecedented, its victims countless, each a silent witness to horror few could fully grasp. The medical experiments alone defy comprehension. Pierce described children deliberately infected with disease to monitor progression, exposed to toxins, or subjected to surgical procedures without anesthesia. Each small life was valued not for its potential, but for the information it could yield, the scientific curiosity of men unmoored from morality. The horror was compounded by the corruption that enabled it. Officials at orphanages, poorhouses, and local governments were bribed or coerced. Judges rubber-stamped the disappearance and adoption of children who had, in reality, been sold. Even law enforcement at times turned a blind eye, intimidated or incentivized to protect the network. The prosecutions that followed were complex, protracted, and grueling. The legal system, stretched across multiple states and jurisdictions, struggled to impose justice on crimes that had been meticulously planned to evade accountability. The wealth and influence of the perpetrators, the entanglement of their connections, and the sheer audacity of their cruelty presented challenges unprecedented in American history. Yet, through witness testimony, records, and the courage of those who survived, the full scope of the network slowly came to light. It was a revelation of human depravity, so meticulously organized, so deeply entrenched, that it forced the nation to confront the capacity for calculated evil lying beneath the veneer of civilization. The children, trafficked, experimented upon, and sold as if they were mere property, became the silent testimony to a truth more terrifying than fiction. Even now, the whispers of this network drift through the archives, through letters yellowed with time, through the voices of those who endured. The horror persists, not merely as a shadow of the past, but as a lingering echo that chills and compels all who dare listen. This is a story of darkness, cunning, and cruelty so precise it defies comprehension, a story that continues to breathe from the margins of history. Whisper to those who seek it in Gospel of the Haunted, even as the final gavel fell and courtrooms emptied. The shadow of the Sullivan network lingered, twisting through every corner of society like smoke that refuses to dissipate. Several of the key perpetrators had slipped through the cracks, legal loopholes, political influence, and wealth shielding them from consequences that seemed, to ordinary citizens, as though justice had abandoned them. Yet, the exposure of the network had already ignited a fire that no technicality or bribe could extinguish. It was a revelation so horrifying, so intimately human in its cruelty, that it demanded reform. The case became a catalyst, shaping the very first federal legislation aimed at curbing child trafficking and protecting the most vulnerable. Orphanages and poorhouses came under stricter scrutiny. Laws were amended, and the foundations of child welfare in America were forever altered. The Sullivan trial did not conclude in weeks. It sprawled over nearly 5 long years, each moment punctuated by the public's morbid fascination. Newspapers across the country pored over every grim detail, printing long, detailed accounts that forced the horrors into homes that might have otherwise remained ignorant. And yet, while the world gawked, the rescued children faced a far more personal struggle, the slow, painstaking process of reclaiming their humanity. 47 children, each haunted by years of darkness, starvation, and abuse, were forced to relearn the simplest acts of daily life. Smiles, conversation, trust, these had to be taught again, with patience, vigilance, and care. Many never fully healed. The scars of captivity were etched not only into their flesh, but into the very essence of their being. Among them was Rebecca, the 14-year-old whose unwavering memory and courage had been instrumental in unraveling the sprawling web of crime. Though the world hailed her as a heroine, the attention proved nearly unbearable. She was eventually placed with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, in a home where silence and stability offered sanctuary. There, she could breathe without fear, learn to trust again, and, over the decades, carve a life separate from the nightmare she had endured. She would live to the age of 73, marry, and raise children of her own, yet never speak publicly of the terror she had witnessed. Justice, however, was uneven. Ezra Sullivan, captured during the initial raid, faced the full weight of the law. Convicted on charges that ranged from kidnapping to murder, he met the hangman's noose in Richmond, before a crowd of over 3,000. Witnesses recalled his final confession, a chilling acknowledgement that he had walked the devil's path, coupled with a plea for forgiveness from the very children he had tormented. Henry Blackwood's trial revealed the grotesque depth of his cruelty. Medical records, meticulously maintained, documented the calculated torture and systematic killing of children, a revelation so monstrous it shocked even the hardest investigators. Convicted of multiple murders, Blackwood's death sentence was delayed by years of appeals and political machinations. He ultimately died in prison, ostensibly of a heart attack, though whispers suggested poison, a desperate act by associates fearful of secrets being revealed. The two Charleston Medical College physicians who had aided Blackwood were expelled and imprisoned. Their actions sparked reform in medical ethics, regulations that mandated oversight for research involving human subjects. The college itself teetered on the brink of closure, as investigators uncovered faculty complicity and negligence, a culture of silence that had allowed horror to flourish in plain sight. Yet, frustration and indignation persisted. Numerous influential figures had eluded punishment entirely, some fleeing to Europe, others exploiting political connections to avoid imprisonment. A Georgia legislator, heavily implicated as a buyer, received only censure while his deeds remained legally unpunished. The financial dimension of the network astounded investigators. Constance Sullivan alone had amassed over $12,000 in illicit profits across 20 years, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. Much of this fortune vanished into legitimate ventures or hidden accounts, never to be reclaimed. The Sullivan property itself became a haunted monument, a house that refused to shelter life or hope. Seized by the government and auctioned, it found no buyers willing to inhabit a place steeped in unspeakable evil. The structure was demolished and its basements filled with concrete, sealed as though to bury the memories alongside the children who had perished there. A small cemetery was established on the grounds, a fragile memorial to the innocents lost, though most of their names had been swallowed by time, forgotten by history, remembered only in whispers. The Sullivan case rippled outward, shaping laws and awareness alike. Virginia enacted the first comprehensive child protection statutes in the nation, mandating oversight of orphanages, requiring background checks for guardianship, and setting the stage for systematic protections that would spread to other states. At the federal level, the government created statutes to confront interstate trafficking, acknowledging for the first time that crime knows no borders and that children's lives demanded more than fragmented, local vigilance. The trial's legacy was not simply legal, it reshaped the public conscience. Citizens were forced to confront the vulnerability of children, the ease with which corruption and cruelty could thrive, and the necessity of vigilance, of systems designed to protect those without voice or power. The horrors of the Sullivan network, the trafficking, the torture, the deaths, lingered as a cautionary tale, a specter that reminded the nation, and all who would listen, that evil can be methodical, patient, and terrifyingly human. Even today, the echoes of these events persist. Through faded documents, surviving testimonies, and the whispered recollections of the rescued, the story of the Sullivan children continues to haunt. The fear, the courage, and the relentless darkness remain alive in the imagination, a chilling reminder of how close humanity can edge to unimaginable depravity. It is a tale not confined to history, but living, breathing in every shadow, every secret, every silent corner, where the vulnerable might once again need a voice. This is the enduring legacy of the Sullivan case, a story of terror, justice, and the fragile persistence of hope, preserved forever in the chronicles of Gospel of the Haunted. The questions raised by the Sullivan case rippled far beyond the confines of Millbrook, stirring a profound reckoning within communities about their responsibility to the defenseless, the small, the unheard. It became painfully clear that evil thrives not only in shadows, but in the blind acceptance of appearances, in the polite silences of neighbors who assume that respectability is a guarantee of morality. The Sullivan farm, hidden in plain sight, had proven that the most grotesque atrocities can unfold behind the most ordinary facades, unnoticed for decades. It forced a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that vigilance is not a choice, it is a duty. The legacy of the Sullivan horrors extended beyond legislation and law enforcement. The meticulous records, letters, financial ledgers, and testimonies preserved in the aftermath became more than evidence. They became a lens through which historians, criminologists, and social reformers could study the mechanics of systematic evil. They offered a chilling demonstration of how manipulation, fear, and cunning can be woven into the fabric of a community, and how even seemingly benign institutions can conceal terror. Through these documents, generations would learn how depravity can wear the mask of normality, how cruelty can masquerade as care, and how human suffering can persist unnoticed when the world chooses to look away. The ultimate dismantling of the Sullivan network was not achieved through cutting-edge detective work or the technological marvels of modern investigation. It was achieved through courage, the raw, unpolished bravery of ordinary people refusing to remain silent. William Hutchinson, who first noticed irregularities and chose to report them despite fear of reprisal, set a chain of events into motion. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who dared to take these concerns seriously in a community still steeped in complacency, became the instrument through which justice could begin to take shape. And Rebecca, the girl who had survived years of imprisonment and torment, summoned the strength to speak, to remember, and to testify in ways that no one could ignore. Their collective courage illuminated the darkness that had long been allowed to fester. The basement itself, where 47 children had been discovered chained and silenced, remained sealed, a tomb for memories and suffering that refused to rest. Yet even as the walls were closed, the echoes of those children's anguish continued to reverberate, reminding every observer that evil is not always loud. It is patient, it is silent, and it can persist unless it is confronted. The Sullivan case serves as an eternal warning that the vigilance of the few can break the power of the many. That conscience is a weapon as potent as law, and that courage can illuminate the deepest recesses of horror. The reverberations of the case reshaped societal perceptions of child care, institutional responsibility, and moral oversight. The romantic notion of orphanages and private guardianship was replaced with a practical recognition of the necessity for systemic protections, regulatory oversight, and ethical scrutiny. Laws and reforms followed, slowly, sometimes grudgingly, but decisively, creating the foundations for what would become modern child welfare practices. Communities were reminded that innocence cannot defend itself, and that trust without accountability can be a dangerous thing. Even decades later, the Sullivan case whispered its lessons. Scholars dissected the correspondences, tracing threads of exploitation across multiple states, exposing networks of criminals, complicit officials, and profiteers who had once operated under a veil of respectability. These documents told stories of children treated as commodities, of lives measured in transactions, of morality subverted by ambition and greed. Each letter, each ledger, became a fragment of memory, a ghostly testament to the lives that had been manipulated, stolen, and lost. Yet, amidst the horror, there were glimpses of human resilience. Survivors, with careful support and dedicated care, learned to speak, to trust, to rebuild pieces of lives that had been shattered. Some, like Rebecca, found refuge in nurturing environments, growing into adulthood with the faint hope of stability, of love, of family. Others struggled endlessly against the shadows of their captivity, wrestling with trauma that had burrowed into the deepest recesses of their minds and bodies. Their stories remain a testament to both the fragility and the tenacity of the human spirit. The Sullivan case revealed, with painful clarity, that evil is rarely an isolated act. It is a system, a network, an interwoven tapestry of greed, silence, and deception, and it demands a collective response, a vigilance that cannot be outsourced to chance or hope. Communities learned, sometimes painfully, that it is not enough to assume that justice will arise on its own, that evil will inevitably be punished. Instead, it requires the courage of witnesses, the moral fortitude of ordinary citizens, and the unflinching dedication of those who refuse to look away. In the quiet hours, when one considers the dark corners of Millbrook, the sealed basements, the forgotten cemeteries where nameless children rest, the horror remains palpable. It is not merely history, it is a living presence, a whisper that wins through the archives, through letters, through the spaces between memory and record. The Sullivan case endures as a chilling reminder that darkness can reside behind even the most ordinary doors, that human cruelty can be patient, methodical, and cunning, and that courage and conscience are sometimes the only light capable of confronting it. To reflect on the Sullivan story is to confront the duality of human nature, the depths of depravity alongside the heights of bravery, the power of secrecy against the force of truth. It is to recognize that vigilance, courage, and compassion are not abstract ideals, but essential shields for the defenseless. It is a cautionary echo that reverberates to this day, urging those who listen to act, to question, and to remember. For in these echoes, in these stories of horror, resilience, and reform, the past continues to speak, demanding attention and reflection from all who dare to hear. The Sullivan case stands, therefore, not only as a monument to evil, but as a testament to the potential for conscience to disrupt tyranny, for courage to pierce darkness, and for society to evolve in response to the horrors it refuses to ignore. And as the shadows of history shift and whisper, the tale lives on, forever chronicled in Gospel of the Haunted, compelling us to never forget, to remain vigilant, and to honor the lives of those who suffered in silence, yet spoke through the courage of those who would not remain silent.